Hi, welcome to Season 4 of Product Ops Podcast with me, Gerisha Nadaraju. This season, I'm joined by a special co-host and prior Season 1 guest, Dr. Kevin Sakamoto. Each week, we'll be chatting to Product Ops practitioners, consultants, and thought leaders about how they make their value visible. Listen in for practical tips on how to drive real organizational impact with Product Ops. Hugo, welcome to Season 4 of Product Ops Podcast. I guess welcome back because you were actually a Season 1 guest, so it's quite exciting to have you back. How are you doing today?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm doing well. It's good. It's a nice sunny day outside. And so, yeah, having a good day today.
Yeah, where are you? Are you still based in Lisbon, was it,
Yeah,
Hugo?
we're expecting 40 degrees Celsius temperatures this week.
Wow. Okay, so proper summer. I'm in London and I think it's going to be in the high 20s, maybe getting close to 30. So that's very hot for here.
And I'm in Los Angeles, and today it's going to be 32 Celsius. So it's a little warm.
Okay. Summer is here finally. So, enough about the weather. To get started and get into the podcast, I'm so excited to talk to you about some of these examples that you have, Hugo. But first, it would be great to tell us a bit about yourself and your journey into product ops. It's been a few years since I've spoken to you, so I know you may be in a new role and things have changed. So yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so currently I'm the head of product operations at OLX, which is an online used goods marketplace. And this is mostly in Europe, in Eastern European countries and Portugal. I've been here roughly for 3.5 years now. Started off as the product operations lead in one of the customer domains, which was motors. And then, we became the global team. And basically I have the whole product operations organization reporting into me across 3 different units, across various geographies. And it's been an interesting journey, right? I mean, I don't know, any tech organization is always going through constant change, updates, things happening, and your priorities today change from your priorities in 3 months. And that's been most of that, right? That has been happening. If we go a bit into my background, obviously, we discussed this in the first episode I was part of, but just a quick run through, coming from a design background, graphic design, then moving into user experience, service design, and those kinds of areas, and then moving into the operations role in design, and then later into product. And I still use a lot of that experience from my design background in the work I do today and the way I approach it. And especially the co-design I was using at the time has become super useful because I can use it day to day in sort of getting people on the same page, working through problems or challenges. I use a lot of those design thinking frameworks, methodologies, and things like that, through these things. And so it's been super useful. And yeah, that's me up until now.
Okay, well, two things there, and then I'll let Kevin comment too, because I think he may have something to say there. But number one, now I've done product ops 3 times, so it's been a number of years now, and I do actually think that having a design background is like such a superpower in this area, Hugo. So that's fantastic because I know people talk about obviously having a strong product management background to be able to understand, PMs and whatever, but I think so much of what we do has to do with visualization of problems and design thinking, and how do you actually lay this out and get people to understand things and take them through the different stages. And at every company I've been at, the design team has always been really good at doing that and actually making that change happen and bringing the people together to take them on that journey. So yeah, I think that's great.
And that's a super valid point is design operations has actually been around as a discipline for longer than product operations, because design as a role, they do apply that. They think about these things on their weekend. They enjoy these organizational changes, right? It's super interesting because if you throw something at designers, they go away and they do it. Whereas with product folks, there's always, oh, but does this make sense? And let's question it, let's challenge. It's also the backgrounds, right? It's what we're pushed to do as well and to drive change and all that. And that's how we kind of moved into product operations when I was at Farfetch, because we were doing design, but design was working really well. And our VP of product turned around and said, you know what, design is kind of okay. I really need what you're doing there, but in product. And so that's how we transitioned into it. And I agree, it is a superpower. No, joking. It's useful. It's useful.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I'm curious with your experience with design thinking and design background, and I love the sort of the corollary between design operations and product operations. you've seen a lot of this. You've been in product ops for a while, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think product operations is a transitory role, or is it something temporary, or is it here to stay?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer. So people ask me, for example, doesn't it overlap with program management? Doesn't it overlap with agile coaches? Doesn't it overlap with tech ops and all these other areas? And I say, yes. The truth of the matter is it does, right? There are overlaps. There are things we're doing which is very similar to what those areas we're doing. But the way I try and frame it is this is an iteration, right? All of these roles are an iteration towards trying to find the ideal solution. Right. And I remember when we were talking about it in the beginning, it was very super easy. Oh, no, it's about enabling, force multiply and everything. And then I remember John Cutler came out with a great document that he pushed out, right? And he said, oh, there's a difference between the enablement and the operations. And you're like, whoa, okay, wait. Right. And he's right. And I also see that in the teams, when I'm managing the teams, when I'm thinking about product operations is you see the evolution, right? When it starts off, it's one thing. But as it evolves, as the organization evolves, as the methods and everything that we build evolves, even the makeup and the structure and the characteristics we want for the team also change. And so I think it's all going through a constant change. The problem right now is that product ops seems like it's a role for everything. It's flashy, it's trending. I saw the same thing when I was moving into user experience. It was trending. Now there's a big discussion. UX has to disappear. It's like, please. These things just keep going around in circles. We always have this because people want to define it, you define it. Then someone else throws in and says, no, it's not this, it's that. And then another person comes in and says, no, it's not this, it's that. And yeah, it just gets very confusing. I think as a need, every organization has product operations, right? That's not going to change. Whether you have people doing it or don't, you have the operations of that organization. So that's going to exist. As a role, people are seeing the value of it. What I think the challenge is happening right now, people trying to figure out how much investment they should make in it, right? Because I've seen very many organizations that have developed and they've built a huge team. And then you quickly realize, hold on a sec, this is too big a team. We don't need all these people because I need people building a product, not people working on the ways we work, on the systems, on the frameworks. But at the same time, if it's too small, they almost can't tackle everything that they need to tackle. And it's trying to find that balance of that fluidity. And I think this is where they're struggling right now. And obviously seen as an enablement role, people will look and say, do we really need it? Shouldn't product leaders and this is from the early days, we heard this in the beginning, right? Which is, shouldn't product leaders do this? Shouldn't, PMs be doing this? The quick answer is yes, they should. Do they have the time? No. Do they have the headspace? No. Can they deep dive on some of these things? They can't, right? And so that's where they need the extra power extra someone else who can come in and maximize on that and evolve. But then again, you look and you think, if the team is too big, do they just become an admin role with tons of admin people? Or in some cases, I've seen it where they're actually doing product management work. They are the product managers. Product managers are product owners. And then so it becomes very confusing and you're like, hold on, so I think there's a lot of confusion. And because of that, it's hard to pinpoint, is it the right role or isn't it? Because people are trying to figure out where this fits in.
Yeah, I love that explanation. And I kind of want to double click into definition. So when I'm not doing product work, I'm an academic as well. And we like to define things in so many of our papers. We just have to define what X, Y, and Z are. Is it then more of, for product operations, defining the need? Would you say that defining the need should take priority over defining the role?
To an extent, yes. To an extent, yes. But even when you define the need, you kind of have to define how much of that you need, right? Like what level, how much complex is it? And both of you, I know, have worked in startups, so you know what I'm talking about. When you're a small team of 10 people in a room, someone turns around and says, oh, I've got an idea. I read this book. Let's test this out. Cool. It's done. In 5 minutes, it's done. You're testing it out, right? When you're working in a huge enterprise organization, you can't just, go to a meeting and say, oh, we're going to change everything. Everything's going to fall apart, right? So we have to understand there, for example, in these big enterprise organizations, making any change is a challenge, even if you have a team of people. So if you don't have people specialized looking at that, it's going to be even more challenging. And you can't unless there's a huge remit where the top leader understands and drives something. And even then they're going to get constant pushback and things aren't going to work out.
I think it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot in there, Hugo, but if I bring it back, because I always try and relate stuff to what I'm going through too, it helps it stick for me. But I've done product ops now at a startup, a scale up, and I'm now in a very large, almost like a little bit corporate style environment. So old, it's been around for a while. And while the problems are similar, it's the same kind of challenges that you're seeing, whether it's like product having to interact with sales and strengthening that feedback loop or customer facing teams or, whatever it is, there's very similar challenges. But how you tackle these challenges is very dependent on the context of the company that you're in. And what product ops looks like is also dependent on the size and stage of these companies and what roles they had already in place. Were they agile coaches? Were there program managers? Are the product management leaders really strong product management leaders who have the capacity to lean into these other things? Or are they completely flooded with stuff, or maybe have been at the company for 25 years and haven't done product somewhere else? So maybe don't have all of those new ways of thinking about product in place. It's so dependent on the situation. And I struggle there with people trying to like force or say that product ops is one thing or another thing, because if you haven't been on the ground in the companies dealing with the problems and figuring out how to fix them, I think that just saying it's one thing or the other, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's like really missing the nuances and the reality of what you have to do day to day.
Well, that's actually a super valid point. And I like to think about it more about what is the purpose that we have, right? And the purpose, if it's very clear, that it will change depending on the organization, like you were saying, right? And for example, I know in our team, we've got this really flashy vision and mission statement, right? And all this stuff. And a couple of months ago, I was looking at it and I was thinking, you know what? Our actual mission statement should be just make the product organization more efficient and effective in the way they function and operate. That's simple. Or how they bring value to customers. That's just it. And that's all we have to do. Now, how that works and the makeup of that changes depending on the organization, depends on the week, right? Depends on the day sometimes. It'll change constantly. And this is something that, it's like I tell my team, there's things that are very clearly in our remit. There are things that are very clearly not in our remit. There are so many things that are in a gray area because depending on the day, depending on the need, you might need to jump on those things and you will have to take them on. And the idea is it's about reducing that complexity and making it simpler and, helping people, helping teams feel, and that thing of teams feeling empowered. It's not just, oh, now you can make all the decisions you want. No, it's that they have the tools to make those decisions, right? That they have what they need to do to be able to do that. And it's like, I created this incredible system. Now you have to wait in line for 50 people and it's like, no, that's not going to work. But if I just put the system in the hand of the people and now you can do it with it, whatever you want. I've empowered them to an extent, right? So we also can drive these things and drive this change. And that's usually what we try and do.
Mm. That's a nice way to set up what is the type of work that Product Ops does, because the theme for this season is around making value visible. And the reason for that is that, as you mentioned, like sometimes this is a function that can be doing a lot of busy work or be a catch-all where you're doing tons of different things. And in a way, in order to stay relevant within an organization, you need to hit that sweet spot where you are showing that this team is delivering value and is being felt by stakeholders. I would love to hear from you, Hugo, of maybe one, if we have time, maybe a second one, but like one key example of actual work that you or your team did that you felt drove a lot of impact and alignment and visibility and value within the organization.
I've got quite a few examples we can bring up, and we can even go into huge philosophical discussions around the topic. But like I discussed before, I think I brought this up was, for example, I'm very proud of the OKR program we implemented, which was something that it took a while, right? It took a while. And it took a while on purpose because when I was still in the Motors organization at the time, I remember one of the things was everybody had been doing OKRs in the various companies, even in the company they'd been doing OKRs, and it was kind of working. But there was always this feeling of we're not getting to the places we want to get, or we're not focusing on the right work potentially. And there was a lot of work that was done that was interesting. One was looking at the organization and figuring out the North Star metric framework that was built together, right? The inputs, everything. It gave everybody the metrics for these different types of levels that we're working. Another thing we did was we actually let the product leaders, we gave them the space, the product and engineering leaders, we gave them the space to, in your domain, you can do it the way you want to. for now. And we left them for a year doing it their way. The only thing they had to do was they had to present at the end of each quarter. They would have to present how did the previous quarter go, and how's the next quarter going to go. And then when we reached the end of the year, we both myself and the product director at the time, we sat down and we started looking and saying, okay, it's incredible. We're seeing great stuff, but there's a mix of complexity. There's no consistency, or there's little things where it doesn't connect properly. There's a bit of a mess in certain areas and everything. So how can we elevate it even further? One of the things we looked at first was, for example, how people are measuring OKRs, right? And there's the whole 70-80 thing that came from Google, and everybody talks about that. Oh, because 70 you've achieved, but you want to try and hit the 100 because then you're overachieving. Problem is that this is great on paper. When you explain it to people, they all seem to get it. In day-to-day, it absolutely never worked. I don't know if the same in other organizations, but at least for us, it was never working. And trying to convince stakeholders that this was the way it was to do it was very confusing. So what we did was, let's make it 100%. And it's 100% where we want to try and get always to the 100%. Ideally, we always shoot for the 120 or the 110, but the 100% is what we're committing to actually delivering. And so with that, it reduced the complexity for the teams, and the teams were able to, because they were actually becoming more cautious. And with this, they actually started driving a bit more change. And then another thing we did was, and I know it's just, some people are talking about it now a lot more in the industry, but we defined 3 types of KRs, which was, you've got the delivery, the discovery, and the outcome KRs, right? And the idea here was, it was giving people the space to be able to reflect all the work that's going on without feeling, because we saw that teams had OKRs, the outcome only, but they would only impact that outcome in 3 quarters. And so it seemed like they weren't doing work, right? Like it wasn't happening. It was depressing for the teams. It almost seemed like that was always sitting there. And so by doing this, the teams could then just say, okay, here are my 3 outcomes that I'm going to try and hit. These are the things I'm discovering, and these are the things I'm working on delivering in the next quarter or so. What we realized this also generated was a lot of the habit around the dual track, right? That is so hard sometimes to generate in teams, because the teams felt they had the space, because it was reflecting all their work, that they could then do the dual track. And so, it was okay. We know that 100% of their time isn't just around outcomes, because that would be preparing for the next quarter. And so every single quarter, there was always outcomes, deliveries, and builds, right? Things that they were doing or discovering. And this was continuously happening across all the packs. We also, gave them 2 or 3 simple rules that everything has to be measurable. And we did this very simply, right? When we presented it to them, we said, here are the 4 main things that you have to think about. We just gave them 4 things. What it generated in the background was a lot more complex, but it just these 4 things, it was easy for them to take away. But, and this is one of the big superpowers of having good product leaders, is I didn't have to go and hold every single PM's hand and work with every single team in getting their things right, because the product leaders grabbed that and they took the translation on themselves. They worked with their teams, they coached their teams, they mentored their teams in doing this. So they were the amplifier of the work we were doing at the leadership level, right? Without them, that wouldn't be possible. And what was interesting was that we slowly started influencing how the things were working. It was working really well. It was then developed and then also expanded to the other areas of the organization once the team became bigger. And it got to a point where it was good enough that we're even looking at expanding it across other areas of the organization, not just product area. And this is a project that's going on right now.
That's really fascinating. I get a sense of your design background that's coming through there. You mentioned about reducing complexity, making it simple, the cycle of delivery, discovery, outcome, right? Those 3 simple steps. The 4 things you give to the product team, so you don't need to hold their hands, right? And how you said it concluded by it now expanding this behavior, this practice is expanding. How much of that do you attribute to your design background, that by making things simple, 100%, none of this 70-80, right? Here are the 3 things: delivery, discovery, outcome.
Almost everything. Because what happens is, it's an interesting thing, and it's something I'm pulled into sometimes, because if someone puts a deck in front of me, I'll look through it and I'll say, the content is incredible, loved reading through it. And I'll say, but you've lost the audience after the 5th slide. There's too much stuff here. It's too much for people to absorb. And so what I try and do is, it's always this thing of, I always think about the end user, right? How do we make sure that it's comfortable for them, that they understand it? Because I've gone through some complex changes, I also think, if I'm going to present them with this huge long list of changes that are going to happen, I know what's going to happen, right? It's going to fall apart. People are going to go crazy. People are going to give up. We'll start seeing rotation and everything. Whereas if I keep it simple and, in this case, it's interesting because we defined these main things and I had one question where someone turned around. I can't even remember what the question was, but they asked me, "Oh, Hugo, but in case A, when I want to do this and that, how should I do it?" And I turned around and I said, "You know what? I didn't even think about that." And I turned around and I said, "But how do you think it should be solved?" And they said, "Oh, I think it should be solved this way and that." And I say, "Great. Anyone else have anything against that?" And nobody said anything. Let's test it out. If it works well, we'll scale it out to the rest of the team. So it became about being adaptive to the people as well, understanding them, but telling them, look, there's space for you to also test out things, because we realized we couldn't figure out every little aspect of it, because there are stuff we won't be. There's hedge cases, there's things we haven't considered. And sometimes at this tactical level, because I wasn't able to go into all the tactical level things, sometimes we won't be able to answer all the questions. So we try and keep it in such a way that they can also adapt and change. And we gave the team space to test out new things, to incentivize change themselves.
This is such a relevant example to me at the moment, Hugo. And one of the things with OKRs that I find I'm curious as to, you mentioned the product leaders, so maybe this is part of the answer, but a lot of the time OKR just feels like a process. It feels like, oh, it's OKR, time to do the OKRs again. And before you know it, like 3 months have gone, you've got to kickstart this process. I don't know how in advance you do it, whether it's a month or 2 weeks or whatever it is. And it's so much of coordination, and you feel a bit like you're herding cats, and it's a lot of get this in by this date, and you have to do this, and things have to happen. Do you feel at all like you're chasing people in trying to do this? Or how much involvement does product ops actually have in this now that you've set it up or you've improved the process? Is it for the product leaders to drive, or do you and your team feel like you're pushing this?
Well, this is an interesting point. OKRs, number one, going back to your initial point, right? OKRs, people forget the reason why we do OKRs. They think about it as a solution to something. It's going to solve all my problems. And if it isn't driving impact and change, just don't implement them. Actually remove them. What do you want to do? I want to deliver value to customers. Are you doing that in the best way possible? No. Then add OKRs. Maybe it'll help you. It didn't. Okay, then let's do something else. And I think people lose track of that. They think they start focusing so much on the actual process of it. And it isn't that complex. It's like, where do I want to achieve? What can I achieve this quarter? How do I make it a bit more ambitious? It's just that simple, right? But people have difficulty with this. In terms of the actual work, this is one of the things, and it goes back to the topic we were discussing, which was around the ownership or accountability for product leaders. My team and I, one of the things we agreed was, as much as possible, we will not do the work for the product leaders. Because if I'm doing their work for them, why were they hired? So one of the things we do with these things around OKRs is, or with any processes, we will present it to the people, and the expectation is that these product leaders and engineering leaders will take it and to their teams and translate what's working or what isn't working. In some cases, they'll reach out and say, I actually have no idea how to approach this. Almost never do that, though, because they're embarrassed, I guess, I don't know, to admit that they can't. But when they do reach out, we will help them. We will go there, support them, coach them through it in the beginning, but we always try and make it in a way that we enable them, right? That we make it so that they can do it, rather than, oh, now I'm going to do it for you. No, it's like, I'll be here. I'll be, the puppet master in the background if need be, but you're the one who's taking ownership. Your team needs to see you're the one who's doing it, because we want our product leaders to evolve. And the thing is, if we do the work for them, if we take it off their plates, they will never reach. We cannot turn around and say we don't have incredible directors of product or VPs of product if we don't ever help them to evolve, because we say, oh no, I'll do the work for you, right? Now you've got this admin person or this personal assistant who will do this work for you. How do they ever evolve? They evolve by learning, by doing, by making mistakes sometimes. So this is something we do if possible, right? Where we will support these teams. We try and avoid running behind people. I tell my team, it's going to come out terribly this quarter, but when they're in the public space then, and you've got one product leader who's come up and presented incredible work, the others are going to start paying attention and saying, hey, I have to do something better next quarter. And so they keep working on this and evolving. And that's what we try and do, which is, it's a type of thing where they will incentivize each other to grow. They will incentivize each other and drive each other to grow and develop and take on this accountability. Whereas if we do the work for them, or if we do too much of the work for them, we find that usually things stall and usually things break down, and then the product leaders don't evolve, and then it seems like the whole organization doesn't evolve, because they're an important part of the wheel, the cog that turns things around. In terms of the cadence, it's one of the hardest things to get right. Generally, people say, oh, it's one quarter, so like a week, 2 weeks to a month before we start planning. Usually it's what I tell people. This is where the dual track is super important. And actually, strangely enough, there are tons of organizations who haven't understood that almost simultaneously, there is always at least three things happening. You're thinking about what you want to build next. You're discovering, right? Is it something I should be building? You're building actually something, and you're launching and experimenting on something. At least these three things are almost always happening simultaneously. What happens is people use agile in the sense of, oh, we're working agile, but what they're doing is waterfall, because what they'll do is I'll do the discovery, then I'll figure out what I have to build because of that. And so it's already broken. Whereas if you're doing this simultaneously, what'll happen is when we reach that OKR cycle, you have a notion of what you want to build anyway. You have a notion of what you're going to drive the next quarter, right? So it's something you can do in a couple of hours, maybe already putting a draft together. If it takes you longer than that, you have to start thinking, maybe I have to think next quarter how to do it differently. And at least this is the way I look at it, or at least we try and incentivize the teams to work. But it's not easy. I paint it as if it's easy, but it's not. It's something we're struggling with all the time.
And I think that's part of the challenge. I love what you said there about avoid running behind people. So in a lot of ways, you're sort of paving the way and showing them sort of that optimized behavior. What do you think are some of the characteristics? What do you think is needed in order to deliver that kind of value? Because seems rather ambiguous to say that we're going to be leading the way and not running behind people. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Look, it's a hard one because, and it goes back to the thing of when people are usually hiring for product operations, what do? They either look at someone who's internal and they just put that person in that role, or sometimes they go and fetch on the market, but they look and they say, oh, I need someone, and they're thinking of someone who's going to be just doing the operations, right? And they bring this person in. And it's like what I suggest and where I've seen it's very powerful is if you can build up a team that initially has very experienced people who have done this work, have done it the correct way, but also the wrong way, right? Who have made mistakes, but have reached that point where they understand where they made the mistakes, what works well in framework A versus framework B, how these things all connect, but can also step back and say, I was wrong, right? This is a super important thing because this type of person has to turn around and say, oh, I read this incredible book. I know all these frameworks and everything. And then you arrive there, you implement something and it goes wrong. And it's like, oh, I'm going to keep insisting. No, you've made a mistake. It's wrong. Think, own it, take it back. So it's a certain level of humility, but with confidence, with experience, with know-how, with how do I like to put it, liking to challenge the thinking, right? And this is something I do all the time. It's, for example, if someone turns around and says, oh, Hugo, I need your team to take this on. Sometimes it's processes I don't like at all, but they'll put it on our plate and I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, fine. I go back to the team and we sit down and I say, okay, team, process is working. It's fine. It's kind of working, but I kind of feel it can be better. And so we question it. So what we do is we stress test the process and see where it can be better and what could be working badly. And then we see how can it improve, right? And it's an interesting thing because of that, we've been able to capture, for example, wasted budget. We've been able to cover wasted meetings, things that were happening, or optimizing. One simple thing we implemented one time was literally just, you've got this template that you use for this deck. You can now copy paste that same one to all the other 5 decks you have to update. And it just meant they had to update it once, right? They had to only create it once. Super easy. Whereas previously it was like, oh, in this deck, it's this template. In that deck, it's that template and everything like that. So making one as the central hub for all of these things, these simple little things, right? You can look at it and say, well, this can be better. And you start questioning these things and you start challenging them. You don't take anything as the status quo because, oh, we've been working for 20 years this way. This is how it's been implemented. And it's like, that's great. But I go back to the basics. And this is where the first principles thinking I like to implement a lot is what are we trying to achieve with this? And then based on that, you think, what is the simplest version of getting from point A to point B? And people have suddenly built up the entire alphabet, right? Getting to point B. You're like, no, folks, literally, it's maybe 3 steps. Although, truth be told, we sometimes also have to add steps to actually make it better. Because sometimes the friction is actually good to have a sense check. Again, all of this comes from the design background, actually, because it's something we used to learn, right? Everybody talks about how in design you take away. And then you look and you say, no, sometimes you actually have to design the friction to make the experience better. I don't know if you know I think it was the Boston airport example. It's a great example, which is people used to complain about the wait time they had on their baggage claiming and the baggage belts. So the folks at the Boston airport, what do? They put the offboarding, the gates further away from those belts. And so people took longer time commuting towards to get there, but they arrived in time for their bags to arrive. And the results were incredible. People stopped complaining about their wait time for their bags.
That's amazing. I love that example. But I also like how it highlights just thinking a bit differently about how you solve the same problem or how. And something I've seen, especially I think as you move into different environments, especially ones where processes have been established and people have been running in a certain way for a number of years, especially in product ops, that ability to not just say, but this is how we've always done it and default to that, or to say, but we've tried to fix this already and we did it like this. And then going back, well, yes, you did try to fix it, but did anybody adopt that process? No. So, if we built a dashboard and you have absolutely no views of it, right? It's amazing that you have this, but did it actually solve the problem and did we have the outcome that we wanted? No. And then maybe there was a reason for it. Maybe the reason was that it was brilliant, but people just didn't see it and it's a case of marketing and visibility. Or maybe there was a problem with how we approached putting that process together. And I think with OKRs, that is somewhere where you often see that, right? Where people have tried to tackle it. They think we should do it this way and we should just keep doing it. And so I did like what you said, Hugo, about the challenging the 0.3, 0.71 way of measuring things. I've seen that. Can't we just simplify it? What's wrong if it's 100%? That's fine, because there's all this thing about like you have to shoot to the moon and it needs to be like 1 and try and just get 0.7 is good enough. But it's confusing and it's open to different forms of interpretation, which when you're dealing with a ton of people who have to fill in something and take away what does that mean, it's so complicated. And then the fact that you introduce different types of OKRs, which is the reality, right? If your OKRs are not capturing the reality of your work, how are you going to get a handle of how things are going? So
And
that's
look, I'm not
great.
going to lie, right? That happens because potentially the way we're doing road mapping might not be well done, right? And so we had to cover for that to an extent. Hey, it worked, right? It worked well for the teams and they felt comfortable with that to the point where it's even hard to get them to lose that now because they're really comfortable with it. Right. And you're like, okay, but we want to go to the OKRs focused on driving ambition, being ambitious and driving. It's like, we get it, but you do realize this is super useful because we can have these.
How did you actually, that kind of touches on it, but how did you realize or how did you measure it? Number one, did you measure to see that what you were doing was actually having impact on this process, like that it was getting better? Or did you just sort of get feedback from people? Like, why was this an example that actually was valuable in your organization?
Well, the truth of the matter is, it's similar to how you do training, measuring the impact of training, right? Where initially you do a kind of quiz and an NPS score, then you go towards seeing if behavior changes in the person, then if behavior changes in the organization. And here it's the same thing. What we did was we started seeing how people started interacting. So we have these OKR critiques every quarter, right? And where stakeholders are there. And what we started seeing was the feedback in those sessions was, oh, this was incredible. This was the best one ever. And we kept getting this feedback. It was better and better and better, right? And right there, you're like, okay, this is great. Then you start seeing that the behavior around how people are discussing these things, how they're planning, how they're doing it, it becomes better and better, right? So the habits become better each time. And then you start seeing organizational change, which is there's always clarity. People know what's happening. There's alignment with stakeholders, there's alignment in dependencies and all this kind of stuff. All these behaviors you start seeing, and there was a positive change. Was it all OKRs? No. But the OKRs were a strong helper in helping people being focused on the right things. And it's interesting because despite the fact that it is only just about your ambitions for that quarter, for example, right? What we have seen is they've been a very strong conversation starter because then what happens is then the team started adding, okay, there's a slide that justifies why the OKR is important. They start putting that there. And so now there's the argument, oh, the metrics have to be here as well, right? Connected to that. So it's clear what metrics are going to impact, how we're going to measure that, the initiatives that might be done around that. And this is aligned with stakeholders beforehand. So it becomes a conversation starter and it becomes that thing which is driving change as well. And it wasn't the OKRs. It was the thing that we had a focus. That's what I like to point it out, right? It was about creating that focus for the team. We could have called it OKRs. I've seen another one, which is around the commitments. I can't remember what it's called, but it's something around commitments. It's the same logic, right? The teams are being very clear on what they're committing to. Stakeholders know what they're committing to, and they're measuring how they're getting along with that, right? It helps keep teams focused.
It's interesting. You mentioned OKRs versus commitments. Jessica, who is one of our other guests, talked about the importance of reframing things and renaming things. It could be the same thing, but just putting it into sort of the language and the culture that the organization understands. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier. It's not just about bringing frameworks. It's about bringing that perspective and how to approach the problem. So would you agree with that? That sort of adapting to the culture, to the way and the norms that things are done, is that a part of product ops? Is that a skill that you would need to bring?
Yes, completely. And if we look at maybe, I don't want to exaggerate, but this is literally coming out of nowhere, but roughly 60 to 70% of the frameworks out there, they already exist somewhere else. Someone just grabbed it and they changed the naming, or they added an extra step, or like we went from rice to ice. We've got, like just an example, right? Simple thing. Someone just literally took away a number, and some people will argue that no, but that reach is really important. Oh, but how do you measure the reach? Big debates. It's not important, right? But and the truth of the matter is, a lot of these frameworks, right? I remember reading some product books when I moved from the design space into the product space, and I'm reading some of the books, and I would literally put half of them down halfway through the book because I'd read the exact same things, but with different wording, with different focus on in the design books. And so for me, it was repeating the same things. And I was like, well, they're not bringing anything new to me because I've been discussing this for the last 10 years in the design space. So they build on each other and they do this. And everybody wants to say they've got a new framework and they're all incredible and everything like that. But sometimes you just have to make a name that is comfortable for people. And I like Chris Compson is the one who presents this. I love the way he says it, which is what a product team's meant to be doing, bringing value to customers in a way that customers are willing to pay for them. I'm paraphrasing, but to an extent, this is what he says. And it's like, I love that. And I've written that down and I keep it in the back of my mind. But just that framing was super simple. I don't know if you've read the book from Josh Seiden and Jeff Gottel on OKRs that has come out.
I haven't read it yet, but I've spoken to Jeff and Josh about sort of lean canvas and lean
because it's an
PM
incredible
training.
thing, right? What I loved is exactly they grabbed OKRs, supposedly seems simple until everybody does it, right? What they've done is they've just changed some of the framing or how you describe certain things. And I was reading the book and half of the stuff I was like, oh, let me highlight that. I love this. I love the way they put this, right? And some of it was just so simple. And around KRs, it was like, what is the behavior you're expecting to see in your customers? The behavior changes expecting to see in someone. That's your OKR. And it's like, oh, so simple. Focus on the behavior change, right? It's these little simple things, and the book is actually super interesting, right? But it's an example I like to use, and it's exactly that. The framing of how we frame things, sometimes it makes a huge difference. You just say a word a different way, and suddenly everybody's like, oh, now I get it. It's like you're translating the complexity, because unfortunately we can't all be academics. And some people don't spend their free time thinking about the stuff. I do. I like thinking about the stuff, right? I enjoy it. But I know not everybody does. So they haven't had the deep thinking or wondering or rethinking it 100 times. And so you come to them and it's like, oh no, I thought we can go to this concept. They haven't had the time to get to that point yet. And it's like, I'm not getting you, Hugo. So I have to bring it back, because it's like, again, the same concept. They're not in your mind. They don't have all the context you're thinking of.
I think that has to do a lot with meeting people where they are. And that's actually a very hard lesson that I've had to learn in my career. I don't know if you've done the same, Hugo. I've made this mistake, especially in the beginning. You come in and you're like, oh, okay, here's a problem, right? I know how to solve it. Here's my way of thinking of what I think an ideal solution or process or whatever is. But then you take that to people and they don't react in the way that you think they would react or how, you would. And it was a hard and steep learning curve to go through to realize, oh, even if I think I'm doing a good job or I'm coming up with a solution to something, if it doesn't land with the audience or I'm not meeting them where they are, and where they are could be wildly different and inconsistent in an organization, right? So that adds another thing, like how do you meet all these different people who are at different stages? But yeah, you kind of have to just keep that customer in mind in terms of how you approach it or reframe or the language or anything. It's so important.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but my design background, especially the user experience and service design, gave me tons of tools around that because my focus shifted from, oh, these are the cool designs I'm going to push out to sell stuff and sell brands and things like that, to I'm going to design things based on what the customer needs and with their real world. And because I had to go do behavioral research, observing people, doing interviews, I would have to figure out and build the empathy in the context of their space. So what happens is by doing that, it gave me the tools to then go into any place and assume. And it's one of the tools I love using, which is I never assume I know anything. I go in there and it's like, you tell me, and then we'll see how we work this together, right? And like you said, sometimes the frameworks or the ways I'm thinking of solving it, very often I've got that idea in the beginning, and in the end, it's very similar to what I was thinking in the beginning. But how I get there changes based on the people, based on their context, based on their reality, and also based on what they have to learn to maybe get there. Sometimes it's like every change process is different. Some might take 2 years, others might take 2 months. It depends on the organization, where they are in their different journeys and things like that. So we have to adapt to that as well.
The power of observation cannot be understated, right? It's something that requires a lot of skill, but it also requires a lot of time. And I keep going back to your Boston airport example. I keep replaying that in my mind over and over. That's such a wonderful story, right? And how it perfectly encapsulates what you were saying here. There's the framework of how do we reduce customer complaints about baggage handling times. And depending on the airport, the context, there's so many different ways to go about that. But then from a design perspective and from an ethnographic observable perspective, the only way you can come up with those solutions is actually just sitting with the data, looking at how people flow, looking at where the airports come in, the airlines come in, right? All these different things. And you could see how impatient leaders may say, why, Hugo, are you just sitting with the data for a month? I want to see results. I want to see something. I want to see action right away. So what is the hardest thing you think is about being in product operations? Because to me, it sounds like that's maybe one of them, just observing and sitting with the data. Yeah.
Definitely. Because people, it's interesting because you turn around to a product team and you're willing to give them 3 months to build something, another 3 months to test it out and this kind of stuff, right? They have their quarterly changes. You turn around to product ops and it's like, I didn't see anything in 2 weeks. Why am I not seeing anything, right? I want a solution. But one of the things I like to do, and this is something that's a constant for myself and the team, is we're always looking at what are the quick wins we can do right now. And it's simple things I can implement in a week. It's done and people are working with it. And there I like to use a lean approach. Again, referencing Jeff and Josh because they wrote the book on lean UX, but I like to use that very often, which is I look and say, okay, sometimes there's an experiment I can implement to figure out what's the next iteration of it. I know where I want to get in the end. So I've got always this a lighthouse of where I want to get. So that helps guide me to make sure I don't go off the rails completely. But then it's like, let me test something out because even that is based on assumptions, right? So let me test something out, make sure it makes sense to invest more time, more effort. And so we try and get in people's hands, see how it works. If it works, let's invest more time in it. And sometimes they're quick and dirty. They hack really quickly. And we just test it out and we start going with that and it develops and grows and things like that. Sometimes we will also implement stuff and I get a leader who will tell me, oh, I want this and I'll create it. But then what I do is that the next piece of my work is convincing them that we have to get input from other people in the organization to make sure that everybody sees it the same way, or at least for them to also hear other people might not agree with what we're proposing. And then we work on it. We try and iterate and develop it. But sometimes I also have to tell people, trust in the method. Just trust it. I'm going to have to ask you to, and this is trust you have to build with people. But sometimes I tell them, just trust me. If it doesn't go well, we can drop it. We can drop it in a couple of months. Let's just test it out. There's method to the madness. So I do try and get people to also trust sometimes in these things.
That is great advice, Hugo. I think that is sort of like one of the hardest things also with product ops is I think it's almost that trade-off. It's a trade-off between you're constantly trying to solve problems and oftentimes there's a quick win or a short-term solution, but then you are trying to not just do knee-jerk reaction to just solve it right then. You're trying to think about the longer term scalable solution where you take yourself out of the equation and it's automated or you solve this problem forever. So you're constantly going between almost this like long-term, short-term thinking and potentially doing things that are quite tactical and then strategic. I know this is something Kevin and I have spoken about a lot, is it's almost like you've got to be shifting between that in order to be effective, especially with stakeholders and getting buy-in from them, because you can't just say come back in like 6 months and then I will have something. You need to have solved something for them now also.
But that's actually where I think there is an extra value to the product operations, because very often what happens is when teams try to implement it themselves, everything is disconnected from another. Whereas if you've got a central product operations team, you can guarantee there's this consistent flow towards better. Because if I turn around and say, I want to do better prioritization, I know what that will look like when it gets there. But you can help the steps along that road. Whereas One team will implement rice, another Moscow, another team will do, whatever, jumping jacks in the middle of the street to try and get there. Others will do. People will figure out 500 ways to do it. And then you can never compare any two ideas because each one has done their own prioritization. Product operations can then look and say, before you go into those 500 things, let's test out this one that team has been using. They can help these teams to not go in 500 different directions. So they can help bring that consistency in the teams and things like that. And this is just one example. I mean, there's hundreds of other similar examples.
That orchestration of effort, everyone's got their own frameworks and talents and perceptions, but that orchestration of effort sounds draining. It seems like it takes a lot of energy to do. How do you stay motivated? How do you stay energized to show up every day with so much energy?
I love a good challenge. I actually love it. I complain about it when I've got too many challenges, but I actually love them. It's the type of thing where if I haven't got a challenge on my table this week, it feels like a boring week. So I love the constant challenges and things like that. I've also discovered one thing, and this was useful when I was doing exactly, and Don Norman has this in his book, right, where he turns around and he says, if a user can't do something with your tool or something like that, or people try to blame human behavior, the problem isn't the user, it isn't the people, it's the system or the thing that you designed wasn't properly designed. And that's the way I look at everything, right? Whenever I get feedback or someone's giving me input, I always look at it in the sense of we haven't designed it properly yet, so we need to work on it. So every kind of feedback is we haven't gotten there yet. And sometimes they might be those naysayers who just like to argue against everything. But if those naysayers don't feel comfortable, I still haven't done my job just right because they also have to feel comfortable with it, right? They have to adopt it. They have to become almost a defender, almost someone who will push. And I've seen this. I remember working with a public entity almost 10 years ago. But we went in there and we started talking. At the time, AI wasn't a thing yet. We went in and we started talking about AI systems. And you can imagine, right? Because it turns around and says, what are you talking about? This needs to be validated by a human, this, and that. And we were able to turn around, and this is how I won them over. I turned around and said, you're perfectly right. Everything will be validated by a human. That has to be done. But all those 3 tasks that you showed us you could never do because you never had the time? And they said, yes. And he said, imagine you being able to do them. Every single meeting after that, whenever we would mention AI, the big chief, the people at the top would like, oh, this and that. That person would actually jump in and argue for us. We would just sit back and let the conversation happen. It was just convincing them that it's valuable to them because that's the thing. You show the value, how it will enhance them, how it will make them better. That's one of the great examples of how it worked well.
Since you mentioned AI, what are your thoughts on AI and its influence within product operations?
Oh, I think it's actually both wonderful and scary time. So in terms of wonderful, the amount of things that we can build AI agents to help optimize how we're doing stuff, no doubt about it, it's game changer, right? We can do tons of stuff. Deep down, I don't think AI is in the place we expect it to be yet. And so one of the things that scares me the most is that people become too complacent and they start taking AI as the word of truth and everything that we should. Whereas I feel it's an amplifier, it's an enabler, it's something that helps you think, but people should build up their experience and their know-how. People shouldn't become complacent, right? There shouldn't be that thing where, oh, AI will do it. I'll just throw it in AI and it'll do it for me. Because I guarantee you that when you become too complacent, it's that time where AI will make a mistake and then it'll escalate that mistake 10 times worse. And then you don't know what's gone and what's happened. It's broken down completely. So I think we have to continuously be checking in and making sure things are working well. But I'm a big fan of imagine people not having to do all the crappy work and being able to focus on the cool stuff. That's worthwhile. If AI takes away the cool stuff, that's not as much fun. So
I definitely want for someone like you, Hugo, because as you were chatting, when Kevin was asking you like what energizes and motivates you, I can clearly see from this conversation that you love this kind of stuff, right? You really enjoy the challenges, but you also really enjoy consuming content and learning and upskilling and doing things that are going to help you then solve those problems. I could just see that going, as you were mentioning, books and podcasts and examples and things like that, which is awesome to see. We could chat to you for a lot longer, but I know that we're coming up on time. So I guess my last question to you, Hugo, although you have kind of maybe answered this a little bit at the beginning, but let me just see if I get your final thoughts on it. You've been in product operations for a while now. And I actually think one of the interesting things is that you've been in your role. Well, maybe your role has evolved, but you've been doing product ops in your current company for about 3.5 years, which is quite a long stint in terms of product ops at one company. Sometimes we see people moving around quite a lot, so it's a lot of experience. Has your view on product operations changed from when you initially got into product ops and where you are now? And if so, how?
Oh, yes, it has. And it changes almost every quarter. Why? Because much like I'm looking at how the organization works and continuously thinking about how we can optimize things, with the product operations team, I'm always doing the same. So we look at what we're working on, what we're not working on. We're always looking at the team structure, what characteristics we have on the team. One of the things, for example, I remember in the beginning, I used to think, oh, you have one kind of structure for product operations. Now, for example, I look and I say, I absorb, for example, design and research operations as well. They're also under my remit. And it works because what happens is as these things evolve, it all comes under one to make sure all of them are connected because they can't be disconnected from each other. But then I started looking and saying, but as you start fixing stuff, and in the beginning, we seem to hire enablers, we hire people with this experience in building frameworks, strategic thinking, and that kind of stuff. But then as the product organization starts functioning and these things start going into place, you start looking and thinking, maybe I need more operational people because it now becomes where I have to keep these systems working, the maintenance, I have to help people through them, these kinds of adoption. But you also look at it and you also think, and that's something I always fight against when I learned this when I was in product operations and motors, I started looking and saying, I'm never going to try and hire more than I need. Because the truth of the matter is, if we solve the problems correctly, too big a team, I stop having work for the team. And I can't justify the size of the team. So I purposely never grow the team crazy enough, and they just have to do better prioritization. And that's how we do it. So this is how that's how I've been thinking about it, how it's been changing. But even our role in the teams, how we're connecting to, you start thinking and you start looking and saying that there has to be a difference between the value you're bringing versus keeping the organization working. You have to show both. You have to show the value you're bringing, keeping the organization working. It's fun, but it's not measurable. So how do you find that perfect balance? All of these different types of things. So constant change. And yeah, even last week, I was rethinking a whole bunch of things in my team.
Change is constant. That is a good way of ending things, I think.
And the minute we stop changing and the minute we stop accepting change, it gets boring.
Exactly. So, Hugo, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast and sharing your insights with us. I know Kevin and I have enjoyed speaking to you. We've learned a lot. I've taken down a lot of notes. And I guess if listeners want to get in touch with you or pick your brain about some of the things that you've mentioned, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn, like most folks. And then I have a podcast with Chris Compston, where we send out more or less one episode per month. And it's a loose conversation where we exactly unravel the thinking on some of these things. And so if anyone's interested as well, which is the Thoughts Unraveled podcast on Substack.
Amazing. We'll put a link to that in the show notes when this goes out. But yeah, thank you so much, Hugo.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, follow, and subscribe to Product Ops Podcast across our channels, including Substack. Even better, share it with your friends and colleagues in Product Ops, as that helps others find it. Thanks, and take care.